The plate hit the banquet floor so hard that the whole room stopped breathing. Roast chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes scattered across the polished tile beneath my chair. A wine glass trembled near the edge of the table. Somewhere behind me, a woman gasped. My mother-in-law, Diane Hayes, stood over the mess with her chin lifted like she had just corrected a child in church. Then she said loud enough for every colonel, sergeant, major, spouse, and old veteran in that ballroom to hear, "You don't belong at this table." For one long second, I forgot I was wearing my dress uniform. I forgot the weight of my medals. I forgot the years I had spent serving my country. All I could do was look at my husband. Michael sat beside me, his hands folded, his jaw tight. His mother had just humiliated me in front of 200 people at his father's military retirement banquet, and my husband looked away. That was the moment something inside me went still. Not angry, not broken, still. I slowly pushed my chair back. The scrape of its legs sounded louder than the crash of the plate. Every eye in the room turned toward me. I stood up, smoothed the front of my army dress blues, and straightened the ribbons on my chest. Diane's smirk faded. I looked past her toward the stage where Colonel Richard Hayes, my father-in-law, sat frozen beside the general who had come to honor him. Then I spoke 3 words. "Read my orders." The entire banquet hall fell silent. But to understand why those 3 words shook that room, you have to understand what that night was supposed to be. Colonel Richard Hayes had served 35 years in the United States Army. He was a hard man to impress, the kind who believed shoes should shine, words should matter, and family should never embarrass itself in public. His retirement banquet was held at a hotel ballroom in Northern Virginia, not far from Fort Belvoir. There were flags behind the stage, framed photographs from his deployments, and round tables covered in white linen. Diane had planned every centerpiece herself. She had also made it clear for weeks that she wished I would not come. I had just returned from deployment 3 days earlier. I was tired down to my bones, but Richard had personally called and asked me to attend in uniform. Michael told me his mother was stressed and that I should just keep things easy. So I tried. I arrived quietly. I smiled politely. I took the seat marked with my name. Then Diane marched over, saw me sitting beside her son, and decided my presence was an insult. She knocked my plate to the floor and my husband chose silence. But Diane had no idea what was inside the official ceremony folder on that stage. She had no idea why I had really been invited, and she had no idea that before the night was over, everyone in that room would know the truth. The silence that followed my 3 words felt heavier than the medals resting against my chest. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Diane seemed unsure of herself for the first time that evening. Before anyone could reach for the ceremony folder waiting near the stage, my mind drifted backward to the beginning of a story that had started long before a dinner plate shattered across a ballroom floor. I grew up in a small farming town outside Dayton, Ohio. My father, Harold Bennett, was a Vietnam veteran. He rarely talked about the war, but he taught me everything I needed to know about honor. Every morning began with making my bed properly. Every promise had to be kept. Every handshake had to mean something. "We can't control how people treat us," he'd often say, "but we can always control how we carry ourselves." Those words stayed with me long after he buried my mother and raised me alone. College wasn't something we could afford, so I earned an ROC scholarship. Commissioning as an Army officer wasn't simply a career choice. It was a promise to my father, to myself, and to every soldier who trusted me. Years later, during a joint training exercise, I met Michael Hayes. He was kind, funny, and easy to talk to. Unlike many people, he understood military life because he'd grown up in. His father wore the uniform. His childhood had been spent moving from base to base. I thought we'd always understand each other. When Michael proposed, I believed I wasn't just marrying him. I believed I was joining a family built on service. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first time Diane met me, she smiled politely, but her eyes never warmed. So she said while looking me up and down, "You're from Ohio." It wasn't really a question. Over the years, her criticisms became quieter and sharper. My clothes were too plain. My manners were country. My career made me hard to relate to. Whenever relatives gathered, she somehow managed to seat me at the far end of the table while placing Michael beside cousins she adored. Birthdays came and went without invitations. Family vacations were planned after I'd already been scheduled for deployment. If anyone noticed, no one said a word. Least of all Michael. Whenever I tried to explain how much Diane's behavior hurt, he'd sigh the same weary sigh. "She's just set in her ways, Emily. Please don't make this bigger than it is. Can we just have one peaceful holiday?" Little by little, keeping the peace became another way of asking me to accept disrespect. I told myself Diane would eventually come around, that if I stayed patient, worked hard, and treated everyone with kindness, she'd finally see me as family. Instead, every year the distance grew wider. What I didn't realize was that someone else in the Hayes family had been quietly paying attention all along. And on the very night Diane decided to publicly humiliate me, that silent witness was preparing to change everything. Colonel Richard Hayes had never been a man who handed out compliments easily. If he thought you had done a good job, he'd nod once and move on. That was his way. During the first few years of my marriage, I often wondered if he even liked me. He was polite, respectful, but reserved. Compared to Diane's open disapproval, his quiet distance almost felt comforting. It wasn't until years later that I realized he had been watching far more closely than I ever imagined. Military life has a way of measuring people differently. It doesn't care where you grew up. It doesn't care how much money your parents made. It only cares whether you'll keep your word when it matters most. Over the next several years, my career demanded more than I had ever expected. There were hurricane relief missions along the Gulf Coast after devastating storms. There were months overseas supporting humanitarian operations. There were endless weeks of training exercises that blurred into one another until every airport looked the same. I missed birthdays. I missed anniversaries. I missed Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings. Every time I packed another duffel bag, Diane found another reason to criticize me. Some women know their first duty is to their family. She'd say loud enough for everyone to hear. When neighbors asked where I was, she'd shrug dramatically. "Emily always chooses the army, as if serving my country were some selfish hobby." The truth was far different. Many nights overseas after finishing 12-hour shifts, I'd sit alone in my quarters and video call Michael, hoping just to hear a familiar voice. Sometimes the internet barely worked. Sometimes we'd only manage a few minutes before the connection failed. Still, I never stopped trying. Neither did my father. Even in his 70s, Harold mailed handwritten letters to every address the Army gave him. Inside each envelope was the same reminder: stand tall. Honor isn't measured by applause. I kept every one of those letters. Meanwhile, Michael continued trying to stay out of the conflict. Whenever Diane criticized me, he'd change the subject. Whenever relatives repeated her comments, he'd laugh awkwardly. "I don't want everyone arguing," he'd whisper afterward. But silence has consequences. Every time he avoided confrontation, Diane became a little bolder. Every holiday became a little colder. Every family gathering reminded me that I was being tolerated, not embraced. Only one person seemed to understand what military sacrifice actually cost: Richard. He never argued with Diane in public, but he always asked about my soldiers before asking about me. "Everyone make it home safely?" he'd ask. When I answered yes, he'd simply nod. I figured they would. Looking back, I understand what he was really saying. He trusted my leadership. He respected my service. And without telling anyone, not even his own wife, he had already made a decision about who he wanted standing beside him on the most important day of his military career. That decision was resting inside the sealed ceremony folder on the stage. Within minutes, the entire ballroom would discover why my simple words, "Read my orders," had changed everything. No one in the ballroom dared break the silence. I remained standing beside my overturned chair, my hands resting calmly at my sides. The food scattered across the floor had suddenly become the least important thing in the room. The commanding general sitting beside Colonel Richard Hayes slowly looked toward the stage. Then he spoke in a steady voice. "Sergeant Major, would you please bring me Colonel Hayes's ceremony folder?" A retired command sergeant major hurried to the podium and picked up the dark blue leather folder that had been waiting there all evening. He carried it carefully to the general, who opened it without saying another word. Across the room, I could hear whispers beginning to spread. "What orders? What's going on? Did we miss something?" Diane stood frozen beside the table. Her confidence had vanished, replaced by uncertainty. Michael looked from me to his father, then back to the folder. He looked as confused as everyone else. Only Richard knew exactly what the general was about to read. The general adjusted his glasses and removed a single document. "This," he said, "is Colonel Hayes's official retirement ceremony program approved by his command." His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then he looked up. "Per Colonel Richard Hayes's personal request, the presentation of the Legion of Merit and the retirement flag will be conducted by Captain Emily Bennett Hayes." A wave of stunned silence rolled across the ballroom. The general continued. "Colonel Hayes specifically requested Captain Hayes because in his written words, she best represents the Army values he devoted his career to defending." No one moved. I heard someone quietly inhale. Another guest whispered, "My goodness." The general wasn't finished. He further requested that this selection remain confidential until the ceremony, as he wished it to be a surprise. Every face turned toward Richard. He slowly rose from his chair. Though 70 years old, he still carried himself like the officer he had always been. He looked directly at me. "I made that request nearly 6 months ago," he said. "I've commanded remarkable soldiers throughout my career." He paused. "But I've never known one with greater integrity than my daughter-in-law." The word struck me harder than Diane's humiliation ever could. Richard had never called me that before. Not publicly, not even privately. My daughter-in-law. Across the room, several retired officers nodded quietly. A few veterans began clapping. One pair of hands, then another. Soon the applause spread through the ballroom, not loud or celebratory, but respectful, the kind of applause reserved for earned honor. Diane's face turned pale. She looked around the room as though searching for someone to defend her. No one did. Instead, every eye reflected the same painful realization. She had publicly humiliated the very officer her husband had personally chosen to stand beside him during the proudest moment of his career. And for the first time in years, Richard turned toward his wife, not as a husband trying to avoid conflict, but as a soldier defending what was right. His expression alone told me the hardest conversation of Diane's life was about to begin. The applause faded until the room was quiet once more. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. After 35 years in the Army, he had learned that the calmest words often carried the greatest weight. He stepped away from the head table and walked toward me. Every polished shoe on the ballroom floor seemed frozen in place as guests watched him cross the room. When he stopped in front of me, his eyes fell briefly to the broken plate at our feet. Then he looked up. "Captain Hayes," he said, his voice steady. "On behalf of my family, I owe you an apology." The words caught me off guard. Not because I wanted them, because I never expected to hear them. Richard turned to the hotel staff who had hesitated near the doorway. "Please leave that mess where it is for a few more minutes." The young waiter nodded. Richard wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. He wanted everyone to remember exactly how this evening had unfolded. He faced the room. "I asked Emily to wear her dress uniform tonight because I wanted those who served with me to meet the officer I admire most." A murmur rippled through the audience. "I've watched her miss birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays without once complaining. I've watched her lead soldiers through dangerous assignments and return home with the same humility she left with." His eyes drifted toward Diane, and I watched my own family fail to give her the respect she earned. No one dared interrupt him. Diane's shoulders sagged. For the first time since I'd known her, she seemed to have no words. One of Richard's oldest friends, a retired brigadier general, slowly rose from his chair. Then another veteran stood and another. Within seconds, nearly every retired service member in the ballroom was on his or her feet. It wasn't applause this time. It was something even more meaningful. A standing show of respect, not for rank, not for medals, for character. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I blinked them away. Military training teaches you to stay composed under pressure. Still, nothing had prepared me for this. Michael remained seated. His face had lost all color. He looked from the veterans standing around the room to the shattered plate on the floor. Then finally to me. I could almost see the memories passing through his mind. The birthdays I'd spent overseas, the holidays I'd missed, the countless times I'd quietly absorbed his mother's insults because he had asked me to keep the peace. For years, he'd believed staying silent protected his family. Now he understood something painful. Silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only protected the person causing the hurt. The commanding general stepped beside Richard. "Captain Hayes," he said warmly, "if you're willing, we'd still be honored for you to conduct the presentation." I looked down at my stained shoes, then back at Richard. He gave me a small nod. In that moment, I realized the ceremony could continue. But my marriage could not continue the way it had been. Some conversations could no longer be postponed. And before this night was over, Michael and I were finally going to have the one we'd both spent years avoiding. The retirement ceremony continued with all the dignity Richard had hoped for. I presented him with the folded American flag. The commanding general pinned the Legion of Merit on his jacket, and I read the official citation with a voice that never wavered, though my heart felt heavier than it ever had. When it was over, Richard hugged me. It wasn't the quick, awkward embrace we'd exchanged on holidays. It was firm, proud, fatherly. "I'm honored you were the one standing beside me," he whispered. "Thank you, sir," I replied, because I knew if I said anything more I might cry. The ballroom slowly emptied. Guests shook Richard's hand, congratulated him, and quietly stopped to tell me they were sorry for what had happened. Several women I barely knew admitted they'd noticed Diane's behavior toward me over the years. One elderly widow squeezed my hand. "My husband served for 30 years, she said softly. "I've seen women like her before. Don't mistake someone's bitterness for your worth." I thanked her, but her words stayed with me all the way home. Michael drove in silence. The highway light slipped across the windshield as neither of us spoke. Normally, I would have been the one to break the tension. Not this time. When we reached the house, I carefully hung my dress uniform in the hallway closet before changing into a simple sweater and jeans. Michael stood in the kitchen staring at the countertop. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry." 2 words. Words I'd waited years to hear, but tonight they weren't enough. "I know you are," I answered quietly. He looked surprised. "You do? I know you're sorry you finally saw it." I met his eyes. "But where were you the first time she insulted me?" He didn't answer. "Where were you when she left me off the Christmas invitation?" Silence. "When she told your cousins I cared more about my career than my marriage?" His shoulders slumped. "I remember," he whispered. "I remember every single one. And every single time I continued, you asked me to be patient." He rubbed both hands across his face. "I thought I was keeping the family together." "No," I said gently. "You were asking one person to carry everyone else's burden." The words hung between us, neither angry nor cruel. "Just true." Michael sank into a kitchen chair. "I became so afraid of upsetting my mother that I forgot my first responsibility was to protect my wife." Tears filled his eyes. "I failed you." This time I believed he meant it. But believing him didn't erase the years behind us. I walked upstairs and opened the small jewelry box on my dresser. Inside lay the wedding ring I'd worn every day since our ceremony. I slipped it off my finger. Back downstairs, I placed it gently on the kitchen table. "I'm not filing for divorce," I said calmly. "But I can't keep pretending everything is fine." Michael stared at the ring as if it weighed 100 pounds. "I need some time," I continued. "Not because I don't love you," I paused, "but because I need to find out whether you can become the man I always believed you were." Just then, neither of us noticed the porch light outside or the car slowly pulling into our driveway. Morning would bring visitors neither of us expected. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dinner plate spinning through the air before it shattered across the ballroom floor. Then I heard Diane's voice all over again. "You don't belong at this table." By sunrise I had already made a pot of coffee and was sitting on the back porch wrapped in my father's old army field jacket. The July morning was quiet, but my mind wasn't. Inside the house, Michael hadn't slept much either. I could hear him pacing from room to room. At exactly 9 o'clock, someone knocked on the front door. Not once. 3 firm, deliberate knocks. Michael looked at me from the hallway. "I'll get it." I shook my head. "No." I stood, took a slow breath, and walked to the door myself. When I opened it, I wasn't surprised to see Richard standing there. What surprised me was everyone else: Diane, Michael's younger sister Laura, his uncle Frank, a retired Marine, his Aunt Susan, even 2 cousins who had attended the banquet the night before. No one looked comfortable. Richard removed his cap. "May we come in?" For a moment I considered saying no. After everything that had happened, I would have been justified. Instead, I stepped aside. "Come in." No one sat down right away. The silence inside the living room felt almost as heavy as the silence in the ballroom the night before. Finally, Richard spoke. "I didn't come here as a retired colonel." He looked directly at me. "I came as a father who failed to protect someone who deserved better." His words were sincere. "I should have stopped Diane years ago. I knew she treated you unfairly. I convinced myself she'd eventually change." He lowered his eyes. "I was wrong." I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." Then Uncle Frank cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology too." Looked surprised. I laughed off Diane's little comments, he admitted. I told myself they were harmless. They weren't. They gave the rest of us permission to ignore them. Laura wiped away a tear. "I should have called Mom out years ago." I didn't, because honestly she swallowed hard. It was easier. One by one, family members admitted the same thing. Not that they had mistreated me, but that they had watched it happen and done nothing. The room grew quieter with every confession. Then Diane finally spoke. I never meant. I gently raised my hand. She stopped. For years I had listened while she explained, criticized, excused, and defended herself. Today was different. I don't need another explanation, I said calmly. I've heard explanations for almost 10 years. What I need is honesty. She looked at me with trembling lips. Real honesty, not the kind that blames stress or misunderstandings or someone else's behavior. Just the truth. Diane closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears I'd never seen before. I know why I hated you, she whispered. The room became perfectly still. And for the first time since I joined the Hayes family, Diane was finally ready to tell the truth, even if that truth made her look smaller than she'd ever imagined. No one spoke. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed louder than usual as it marked each passing second. Diane sat on the edge of the sofa with both hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had stood over me the night before. When she finally began to speak, her voice was barely above a whisper. When Michael was little, she said, I imagined every part of his future. She gave a sad smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it came. I pictured him marrying the daughter of another officer, someone from a family we already knew, someone who understood military life the way I thought it should look. She glanced at me. Then he brought you home. I waited. You weren't polished the way I expected. You talked about growing up on a farm. You laughed too loudly. You made Richard laugh. She stopped and took a shaky breath. I told myself I didn't approve because you weren't the right match. Her eyes filled with tears. But that wasn't the real reason. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, though he said nothing. The truth, Diane continued, is that Richard admired you. She looked toward her husband. I spent years trying to earn his praise. He respected me as the mother of his children, but he almost never said he was proud of me. Then she turned back to me, but every time you came home from a deployment, he'd ask about your soldiers. He'd tell his friends what a fine officer you were. I watched him smile when you walked into the room. Her voice broke. I became jealous. The confession hung in the air. Not because anyone believed jealousy excused cruelty, but because it explained something that had never made sense. I convinced myself, Diane said, that if I could make everyone see your flaws, Richard would stop admiring you. She covered her face with both hands. Instead, I became someone I don't even recognize. The room remained quiet. Laura moved closer to her mother but didn't interrupt. Richard finally spoke. Diane. His voice was gentle, almost weary. I respected Emily because of her character. That never took anything away from you. She looked at him with tears streaming down her cheeks. I know that now. I just wish I'd known it 10 years ago. I listened carefully. Every word sounded sincere. Still, sincerity could not erase years of pain. I appreciate your honesty, I said. But honesty is the beginning, not the finish. Everyone looked at me. I can forgive mistakes. I cannot pretend they never happened. Diane nodded slowly. I understand. No, I replied softly. I don't think you do. You told people I cared more about my career than my family. You excluded me from holidays. You made me feel like a guest in my own marriage. I paused. Those things leave scars. She lowered her head. I know. And if there's ever going to be healing, I continued, it won't come from tears today. It will come from what happens tomorrow. For the first time, Diane didn't defend herself. She simply nodded, because deep down she knew I was right. Forgiveness isn't proven by words. It's earned one choice at a time. The family stayed for another hour. No one tried to rush the conversation. There were no raised voices, no dramatic exits, and no miraculous ending tied up with a neat little bow. Life rarely works that way. Before they left, Diane stood in front of me once more. "What do I do now?" she asked quietly. It was the first honest question she'd ever asked me. I thought about it for a long moment. "You don't start by convincing me you've changed," I said. "You start by becoming someone who doesn't need to convince anyone." She frowned slightly, trying to understand. "I've spent years cleaning up after hurricanes," I continued. "When a house is damaged, nobody fixes it by talking about the storm. They pick up one piece at a time." Richard smiled faintly. "That's about the best military answer I've ever heard." A few people chuckled, and for the first time since the banquet, the room felt just a little lighter. Diane nodded. "One piece at a time." Over the next several months, I watched to see whether those words meant anything. To my surprise, they did. Without asking me first, Diane called every relative who had attended the retirement banquet. She admitted exactly what she had done. She told them she had treated me unfairly for years. She didn't blame stress. She didn't blame misunderstandings. She blamed herself. Later, I learned she'd also invited several military spouses to lunch, women she'd quietly influenced against me over the years. She apologized to each of them. Not everyone accepted it. Some were polite but distant. Others simply thanked her and changed the subject. Diane accepted every response without complaint. Meanwhile, Michael kept another promise. He found a counselor who specialized in family dynamics and conflict avoidance. At first, he came home exhausted after each session. "It's strange," he admitted one evening. "I always thought keeping quiet made me a good son." He looked at me with sad eyes. "My counselor asked me something I couldn't answer." "What was that?" I asked. He said, "If your silence protects the person causing harm, who is it really hurting?" Michael shook his head. "I realized the answer was you." His honesty didn't erase the past, but it gave me hope for the future. Little by little, we began rebuilding what had almost been lost. Some evenings, we simply took walks through the neighborhood. Other nights, we talked for hours about things we'd ignored for years. There were difficult conversations. There were tears. There was laughter, too. Real marriages aren't restored in grand gestures. They're rebuilt in ordinary moments. One evening, Richard called. "Emily," he said, "would you and Michael come for dinner next Sunday?" I hesitated. Before I could answer, he added gently, "No banquet this time." I smiled despite myself. "No speeches? No speeches? No broken plates?" He laughed. "I personally guarantee every plate stays on the table, for the first time in a very long while." The invitation didn't fill me with dread. It filled me with cautious hope, because healing had finally begun, not through promises, but through consistent acts of humility, accountability, and grace. By the time autumn arrived, life looked different. Not perfect different. That turned out to be enough. Michael and I still had difficult days, but they no longer ended in silence. If something bothered one of us, we talked about it before it had the chance to harden into resentment. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was honest. One Sunday afternoon, we drove to Richard and Diane's house for dinner. As promised, there were no speeches and thankfully no broken plates. When Diane opened the front door, she smiled nervously. "I'm glad you came." It was a simple sentence, but I noticed something important. She didn't hug me before I was ready. She didn't pretend the past had never happened. She simply welcomed me into her home. That small act meant more than she probably realized. Inside, Richard was tending hamburgers on the backyard grill. He waved his spatula with a grin. "Captain Hayes," he called. I've been informed I'm no longer allowed to overcook these. I laughed. Who informed you? My commanding officer. He nodded toward Diane, who rolled her eyes and smiled. For a brief moment, it felt like an ordinary family gathering. Not because everyone had forgotten the past, but because everyone had decided not to repeat it. After dinner, Richard and I sat on the back porch while the others cleared the table. The evening air carried the scent of fallen leaves. You know, he said, I spent years believing leadership ended when I took off the uniform. I looked at him. I was wrong. He rested his coffee mug on the railing. I should have led better inside my own family. I shook my head gently. You are now. He smiled. Better late than never. Across the yard, Michael was helping Diane stack chairs after dinner. She thanked him, then quietly apologized when she accidentally interrupted him. It was such a small exchange that most people would have missed it. I didn't. Years ago, Diane expected everyone to adjust to her. Now she was learning to adjust to others. Growth often looks ordinary from the outside, but inside a family, ordinary changes can feel extraordinary. A few weeks later, Richard accepted an invitation to speak at a local veterans organization. When he returned home, he called me. They asked what accomplishment made me proudest. What did you tell them? Asked. He chuckled softly. I said, medals fade, promotions end. But watching a family learn to tell the truth, that's something worth remembering. His words stayed with me. Healing hadn't erased the scars. Some memories still hurt. Some holidays still carried echoes of old pain. But those memories no longer controlled the future. For the first time since marrying into the Hayes family, I didn't feel like someone trying to earn a place at the table. I simply belonged. And as Thanksgiving drew closer, Diane quietly began planning a family gathering that none of us would ever forget for all the right reasons. Thanksgiving arrived with crisp airbear trees and the smell of pumpkin pie drifting through the hay house. For years, that holiday had filled me with quiet anxiety. I always wondered what comment Diane might make or whether I'd spend another meal feeling like an outsider. This year felt different before I even walked through the front door. Michael carried the dessert while I balanced a bowl of homemade stuffing. Richard greeted us with his usual firm handshake, then surprised me by pulling me into a warm hug. Happy Thanksgiving, Captain, he said with a smile. Happy Thanksgiving, sir. As we stepped into the dining room, I stopped in my tracks. There, beside Richard's chair, was a place setting unlike the others. The cloth napkin had been folded into the shape of a small fan. A handwritten place card rested against the water glass. It read, simply Emily, not Captain Hayes, not Michael's wife, just my name. Diane noticed my hesitation. I hoped you'd sit there, she said softly. For a moment I couldn't speak. The seat beside Richard had always belonged to honored guests or close family members. In all the years I'd known them, I'd never imagined seeing my name there. Dinner didn't begin immediately. Diane remained standing at the head of the table, nervously twisting her wedding ring. I'd like to say something, she began. The room fell quiet. Last year, I tried to make Emily feel like she didn't belong in this family. Her voice trembled. I embarrassed her in public. I wounded someone who had done nothing but treat us with respect. She looked directly at me. I can't change what I did, but I can tell you in front of everyone I love that I was wrong. A tear slipped down her cheek. You didn't need to earn a place at this table. You already had one. I was the one who refused to see it. No one rushed to fill the silence. Some moments deserve to breathe. I stood and walked around the table until I was beside her. I'm not forgetting the past, I said gently. And neither should you, she nodded. I won't. But I believe people can change, I continued. And over these past months, You've shown me that change isn't measured by apologies. It's measured by choices. She reached for my hand. This time I took it. Not because everything had been erased, but because trust, once broken, had slowly been rebuilt, one honest choice after another. As we returned to our seats, Richard looked around the table and smiled. Now, he said, let's eat before someone accuses me of giving another speech. Laughter filled the room. Real laughter, the kind that comes only after hearts have begun to heal. As we bowed our heads to give thanks, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since becoming a Hayes, I wasn't hoping to belong. I finally knew that I did. Almost a year has passed since the night a dinner plate crashed onto a ballroom floor. People still ask me about Colonel Richard Hayes's retirement banquet. They expect me to talk about the embarrassment, the silence, or the 3 words that stopped an entire room. Read my orders. But that's not the part one remember most. When I think about that evening now, I remember what happened afterward. I remember Richard choosing truth over pride. I remember Michael deciding that being a good husband required more courage than avoiding conflict. And I remember Diane doing something many people never managed to do. She changed. Not overnight, not perfectly, but genuinely. These days, Sunday dinners at the Hayes house have become a tradition. Richard usually tells one too many army stories. Diane has learned to laugh when everyone teases him about repeating them. Michael and I often arrive early to help set the table. Sometimes I catch Diane smiling as she hands me a serving bowl or asks for my opinion about a recipe. They're ordinary moments. That's what makes them precious. Because ordinary peace is something our family once thought we'd never have again. A few weeks ago, Richard invited me to speak to a group of young Army officers and their spouses. When it was my turn, I didn't talk about leadership manuals or military strategy. Instead, I told them something my father taught me when I was a little girl growing up in Ohio. We can't control how people treat us, I said, but we can always control how we carry ourselves. Then I added something life had taught me later. Standing up for yourself doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand calmly. Speak the truth and let your character speak louder than your anger. Several people stayed afterward to thank me. One young woman quietly said, I needed to hear that. I smiled because years ago I had needed to hear it too. Looking back, I realized revenge was never what brought peace to our family. If I had answered Diane's cruelty with cruelty of my own, we might have won an argument but lost each other forever. The real victory came from refusing to surrender my dignity. It came from allowing truth to expose what anger never could. And it came from giving sincere repentance the chance to grow into lasting reconciliation. Families aren't held together by perfect people. They're held together by people willing to admit when they're wrong, make things right, and choose humility over pride. If our story leaves you with anything, I hope it's this. Never let someone else's bitterness decide your worth. Stand with quiet courage. Protect your dignity. Offer forgiveness when it has truly been earned. And remember that respect isn't granted by age, rank, wealth, or titles. It is earned every single day through character. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone who needed a second chance, please share it with someone you love. And if you enjoy stories about family, courage, honor, and hope, we'd be honored to have you join us again for another journey. Thank you for listening. The end.